Yep.
Start recording.
Yes.
I stand in firm affirmation for the resolution. In the United States, we ought to have a single-payer healthcare system. In order to examine the resolution, we need to establish the moral obligations of government, the only obligation of which is justice. This is because the government's purpose is to organize society. Its obligations are not to individuals as such, but only to its citizens. People have specific obligations, but government's obligation is to be equally fair to all. Therefore, the government's only moral obligation is to implement a just system in order to best benefit its citizens. The government of a society can achieve justice by employing a criterion of fairness, described as an equal duty to all citizens. We determine principles of justice by using the veil of ignorance, a hypothetical situation in which representatives of every social class are required to come up with the principles of justice while not knowing the position, social status, intelligence, strength, and the like in the society. This ensures that no one is advantaged or disadvantaged based on the conditions of their birth, and for a fair conception of justice to be achieved. As John Rawls said, the natural distribution is neither just nor unjust, nor is it unjust that persons are born into society at some particular position. These are simply natural facts. What is just and unjust is the way that institutions deal with these facts. Aristocratic and caste societies are unjust because they make these contingencies the ascriptive basis for belonging to more or less imposed and privileged social classes. The basis structure of these societies incorporates arbitrariness out of nature, but there is no necessity for men to resign themselves to these contingencies. The social system is not an unchangeable order beyond human control, but a pattern of human action. John Rawls argues that two principles of justice should be agreed upon in the veil of ignorance. The first principle being the equal liberty principle, which states that everyone is entitled to the same basic scheme of liberties, which is compatible with all others. This principle would be determined because since one does not know his or her initial condition in society, equal liberty would want to be ensured no matter what. The second principle of justice is the difference principle, which states that social and economic inequalities must be structured to benefit the least advantaged. The principle would be determined because if one is disadvantaged at birth, he or she would want to be ensured that a chance at success is still achievable. Contention 1. A single-payer healthcare system would uphold equal liberty principle. David deGrasse writes in his essay, The Single-Payer Means Managed Competition, the case for public funding and private delivery. What a system of multiple insurers has to do is quite different from what we would require of a single payer. Profit-making is not a goal of the enterprise. Breaking even is just fine. There is no need for competitive advertising because there is just one system. Everyone is permanently eligible for services, eliminating in one stroke much unnecessary bureaucracy. There is no need for experts to decipher the rules and regulations of different payers because the single payer will apply the same rules to all enrollees. This evidence shows that everyone would have equal access to the same system of healthcare, not limited based on being born into poverty. Therefore, under a single healthcare system, the equal liberty principle would be upheld. Since a single-payer healthcare system upholds the equal liberty principle, the system already achieves one of the principles of justice, fulfilling fairness and justice in terms of equal liberties to all. Contention 2. A single-payer healthcare system would uphold the difference principle. Subpoint A. As Professor Friedman explains in an essay on affordable single-payer healthcare, this current system of healthcare damages the poor the most. Healthcare financing in the U.S. is regressive, weighing heaviest on the poor, the working class, and the sick. With the progressive financing plan outlined for H.R. 676 below, 95% of all households would save money. In the current system, the poor are the most disadvantaged, which fails to satisfy the principle that in a society, social and economic inequalities must benefit those disadvantaged. In the current society, the inequalities are structured so as to disadvantage the poor who need health care but can't afford it simply because they were born into poverty. Subpoint B. A single-payer healthcare system would give the greatest advantage to the poorest members. As stated, 95% of households would save money from a single-payer system. This would especially benefit those in society who have a minuscule amount of wealth and need the money they would otherwise spend on health insurance. Therefore, having a single-payer healthcare system would uphold the difference principle and therefore justice. A study conducted on health insurance shows that lack of health insurance is related to as many as 44,000 4,789 deaths per year in the U.S. Having a single-payer system would save the lives of those people who can afford the insurance, which would most advantage them, thus satisfying the difference principle and allowing those who cannot normally afford healthcare to have access to life-saving medical care. In conclusion, a single-payer healthcare system would be available to all, allowing everyone equal liberty to have access to potentially life-saving procedures, and would give necessary medical care to those who couldn't normally afford it, most benefiting those in society who are the least advantaged. Therefore, a single-payer healthcare system would satisfy both conditions of justice determined under the veil of ignorance, achieving maximum justice and fairness. For these reasons, I can only see a ballot on today's resolution.
Okay, can you first describe to me why we have a government in the first place?
To protect its citizens.
Okay, so just solely protection. So what is it then?
To organize society.
To organize society. Why do we need organization in society?
Because otherwise, without organization in society, it would simply be a state of war.
Okay, so basically what you're saying, the government is in place to prevent or to arbitrate people so that when they are in a state of war, they can be protected. It's protection, basically, from the transgression of rights.
No, not
Then what is it? Can you specify what it is, please?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so it's protection. So would you say that a single-payer healthcare system, something that provides fairness, not just protection, is actually overstepping the moral obligation of a government?
No.
How so?
Because the government's duty is to justice, and as I established in my case, justice is determined through the principles found through the veil of ignorance. And as you can see, in the veil of ignorance, no one would know their class or social status,
Okay,
and therefore
yeah, I got all that. Can I ask you this question? What if somebody is born to an advantaged class, but becomes a criminal or loses all their wealth and becomes disadvantaged? Wouldn't it be that the single-payer healthcare system is overstepping their boundaries because they are no longer providing solely for the naturally arranged, as you put it, disadvantaged class?
Well, as long as that system still benefits those born into poverty, I see no reason why we should not benefit those who came into poverty by their own way. I mean,
but doesn't that just take away the incentive for people to do well?
No, because if the system benefits everyone in society, but especially the least advantaged, then it would
But these people weren't born naturally into that position, which is what justice is fairness advocates. These people instead made their way to become that way.
Yes, but we're not assuming that the social, economic inequality would give people who came upon poverty the most advantage. I'm saying that the least advantage in society should have the greatest advantage.
Yeah. My opponent? Good? Okay. A.E. Swan once remarked, "Liberty is not something a government gives you. It is a right that no government could legally take away." It is because I agree with him that I negate the resolution. The United States has a moral obligation to adopt a single-payer healthcare system. The resolution questions whether or not the U.S. government has a certain moral obligation. Therefore, I value morality. The only moral obligation a government has is to respect the autonomy of its citizens. Citizens consent to live under the authority of the government with their own autonomy. So for the government to take away that autonomy is immoral because the government is an expression of autonomy itself. Thus, the only way to determine the morality of a government policy is to use the criterion of respecting autonomy. Robert Nozick writes in his book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, that only a being with the capacity to so shape his life can have or strive for a meaningful life. For example, in war, people choose to give their lives in order to fight oppression, which shows that autonomy makes life worth living. Secondly, autonomy is important because people are separate and have distinct intrinsic value. Nozick continues, To use a person in this way does not sufficiently respect and take account of the fact that he is a separate person, that his is the only life he has. He does not get some overbalancing good from his sacrifice, and no one is entitled to force this upon him, least of all a state of government that claims his allegiance and that therefore must remain neutral between its citizens. The moral side constraints upon what we may do reflect the fact of our separate existences. They reflect the fact that no moral balancing act can take place among us. There is no moral outweighing of one of our lives by others so as to lead to a greater overall social good. Since each person is an individual, one cannot be sacrificed for another because such a sacrifice would fundamentally disrespect his identity. The rights to free speech, religion, and voting are a few basic expressions of autonomy. Moral side constraints also apply to economics because money is the fruit of one's labor. Just as surely as taking away the right to vote violates autonomy, by taking a man's property, you deny him autonomy as well. To take money is to take labor. To take labor is slavery. A minimal state operates so that no policy violates a person's autonomy. This is the sole burden of the state. I contend first that single-payer health care system violates individuals' autonomy. My first subpoint is that a single-payer system requires unjust taxation. A single-payer system requires redistribution. In order to provide for the system, heavier taxes must be stated on the wealthier citizens. If money were not going to be redistributed, then we wouldn't need a government system to pay for care. So by forcing a person to pay for care they won't receive, the government becomes more than a minimal state and is no longer an expression of the citizens' autonomy. Unjust taxation converts labor to forced labor and is therefore immoral. My second subpoint is single-payer healthcare changes the nature of relationships between autonomous individuals. When one citizen is forced to take financial interest in the actions of another, the nature of their relationship is changed. One example of this is taxpayer-funded abortion. By forcing a pro-life person to pay for an abortion, the government would violate the first expression of autonomy, the freedom of religion. Another potential violation arises when people engage in risky behavior because they know their medical expenses will be covered. If this happens, laws may be enacted to prevent such conduct and protect the financial interests of the state. When the tax-paying citizen enacts laws to prevent action by other autonomous citizens in order to protect his financial interests, this is a modern form of slavery and is immoral. My third subpoint states that a single-payer system denies appropriate compensation to medical professionals. Not allowing physicians to control standards of care violates their autonomy as medical professionals. Lay page rights. Another disturbing aspect of a single-payer system is the lack of competition among payers, which would reduce physicians' control over standards of care and reimbursement. In a pure single-payer system, doctors can only contract with the one payer available. Currently, in the United States, physicians have some choice of insurers to work with, and even in Medicare and Medicaid, doctors can opt out. But they couldn't do so in a pure single-payer system. This is alarming because medical professionals would not have the ability to set standards for quality of care or reimbursement, which violates their autonomy professionally and also means that they are not paid for their labor because of a lack of competition. I'd like to move on to my opponent's case. The main problem with my opponent's case is that he advocates this policy of redistribution. That is what single-payer healthcare system is. The problem with redistribution is that it violates the autonomy of its citizens. The main point I want to make is that my opponent said during crosshex that the main role of a government is to protect its citizens, protect the autonomy of its citizens. Autonomy is important for many reasons. As I've already stated in my case, there is a distinct intrinsic value of separateness for individuals, and by making each individual pay for another, you're violating the separateness of the citizen's autonomy as a whole. So that could have negative consequences, such as having a pro-life person have to pay for an abortion under a single-payer healthcare system. Another reason why autonomy is important is because it shows itself in separate it manifests itself as political freedom, such as the right to vote or the right to freedom of religion. So if you say that, yes, we can sacrifice one person's autonomy in order to help the so-called general good, social good, you are saying it is essentially the same thing as saying we can take away his freedom of religion or we can take away his right to vote in order to provide for the so-called general good. And that is the problem with a single-payer healthcare system, because it undermines the fundamental autonomy or the fundamental rights of the individual person. Moving on to the equal liberty principle that my opponent states as so important in his case. Again, I'd like to point out how single payer is actually, it oversteps its boundaries as being a correct solution to fixing the natural lottery. Because even if somebody is born into an advantaged class but makes it so that they can't pay for their health care, it was their choices that led them there, and should the government have to violate the autonomy of other citizens in order to provide health care for that person who had actually won the natural lottery? It undermines the entire point of justice and fairness as his case. Now I'm going to talk about the moral obligation that a government holds to its citizens. The single obligation a government holds is to protect the autonomy of its citizens. A redistributive system does not do this, because again, it violates the autonomy of the citizens, and that is bad for various reasons. But the government's moral obligation, what I'm trying to get across to you, is that it is not to provide fairness. It is just to protect its citizens, as my opponent conceded in cross-examination.
What did you state was the role of government again?
To protect the autonomy of its citizens.
Would you say that people would have more autonomy in the state of nature?
No, but I'm going to get into that. Minimal side constraints, or basically it's just the idea that Nozick states in his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, that you can't transgress the rights of another, the three main rights: the right to property, liberty, and life. But those have to be protected for you. So you can do whatever you want as long as the rights of others are not harmed, and that's the main idea. So yes, we may have more autonomy in the state of nature, but I would consider it more important to have those three main rights protected in order for you to properly exercise your autonomy. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
And you stated that a single-payer system would violate autonomy, right?
Multiple times.
Yet, if wouldn't looking at it through the veil of ignorance allow it to see the most fair and equal way in which the least advantaged in society would be?
Again, the role of the government is not to provide fairness of its citizens. The role of the government is to protect the autonomy of its citizens. So yes, while that may be the most fair way to do it, and even then there are some questions about that, it's not the most important way to look at it. The most important way to look at it, or the most moral way to look at it, is how are we going to protect the autonomy of the government's citizens.
What did you state was your first contention?
Yeah. It violates individuals' autonomy. So the first sub-point, if that's what you're looking for, was it requires unjust taxation.
Yet, would a single-payer system unnecessarily tax people?
Yes, it would tax people without their consent. That's the idea of the single-payer health system.
But if they are taking part in the actions of the government, such as healthcare, then wouldn't they give their tacit consent by just taking part of it, give their consent to have taxes?
Are you trying to equate it to something like public funding for education? Because there is a difference. The main difference is that the idea of consent, you don't know how much you're going to use the healthcare, so you're putting your money into the interests of other people when it's being provided for them. Okay.
Now, my opponent stated that her value was morality, and the only obligation of a government is to protect autonomy. Yet, as I've already stated in my case, when people create a government, they, in this hypothetical situation that John Rawls proposes, when people create a government, they would not know which situation they are in. So they could be in the lowest class, they could be in the highest class. But when they create this, these are the principles they would all agree on of justice. Because while my opponent is suggesting that we should simply not have, we should protect the autonomy, what I'm suggesting is that we protect the principles of justice which would be agreed upon in the veil of ignorance, because in the veil of ignorance, if one person is in the lowest class, then they would want to know that they still can count on their right to life being protected by health insurance, or still having a chance to be successful in society. Whereas in my opponent's case, she simply suggests that we only protect the property of people, where I'm suggesting that we allow the least advantaged in society to still have a chance to be successful in society, whether they came upon that by their own way or they were born into it. The difference principle would right the unjust inequalities that are inherent in society, and the equal liberty principle would, a single-payer healthcare system would be taking taxes from people, yes, but it would also be giving everyone equal opportunity to have healthcare, and therefore that would satisfy the equal liberty principle by allowing everybody to have equal access to this. And as my opponent stated in her contention when she stated that it is unjust taxation, but it is not unjust taxation, as these people in society, if they were looking at it, not knowing their class or status in society, they would agree upon a system where they know if they were the lowest in society, they would still be able to have some system of healthcare that would be able to protect their life. And moving on to my own case, she simply stated again that redistribution is unjust. If this is not true, when we're allowing the lowest members of society to be able to have their access to right to life, even if we are taking the property of some other people, it would be giving it to those who have been unfairly disadvantaged in their birth, whether they were born into poverty or some other situation which has been unfairly distributed. The social and economic inequalities would be favored towards them, so that they would have a chance to be successful and have health care where they otherwise would not have it. Because on the negative side, health care would not be provided for everyone, and those in poverty or without lots of money wouldn't have to pay for it out of their own wallet, which they would not necessarily be able to do. And as I've stated, the statistic where 44,789 people die per year without having a single-payer system. And these reasons I can only stand firm about on today's presentation.
Everyone ready? Okay. So it seems as though this ground would come down to a debate, or come down to a clash between his value, what he's valuing it, and what I'm valuing. And what that actually stems from is how are we going to determine what the moral obligation of the government is? Again, my opponent says, or claims, that the taxation that would be necessary for a redistributive system, like single-payer healthcare system, would not be unjust, because the government would be justified in setting up the system because of the veil of ignorance, and he went on to explain that. However, again, I'm going to explain to you how the moral obligation of the government is solely to protect the autonomy of its citizens, and how a single-payer healthcare system does not do that, and the importance of autonomy goes to that. So, my first point that I'm going to make is that, again, there are unacceptable infringements of liberty when people are taxed without their consent, such as in a redistributive system. The sole moral obligation of a government is to protect the autonomy of its citizens. In a state of nature, what my opponent mentioned beforehand, he said, or in cross-examination, he said, wouldn't there be more autonomy in a state of nature? And the idea here is that in order to express that autonomy, in order to express the freedom of religion, in order to not be oppressed, in order to express the right to vote, you need to have the beginning autonomy, or you need to make sure that the main rights are protected by the government. that is the sole obligation of the government. Again, those bare rights, the three distinct rights are the right to property, the right to life, and the right to liberty. And so what this does, what a redistributive system does, is it totally goes past the government's moral obligation of protecting its citizens' rights, and it tries to instill this fairness. But again, fairness is not part of a moral obligation of the state. I've already stated what the moral obligation of the state is, and that is to protect autonomy. So again, my next point is that a redistributive system, or what my opponent advocates under his so-called theory of justice, which is actually not a theory of justice, instead it is unjust because it permits this infringement of rights upon its citizens. And so an infringement of liberty, when people are taxed without consent, equates their labor, or what they work for, to forced labor, and forced labor is slavery. So we're looking at this, and we see how a redistributive system is actually, because it goes past the government's moral obligation, it is actually a modern day form of slavery because it violates the right to autonomy. My second point is that there is no respect for the individual separateness among its citizens. So it forces sacrifice between its citizens, and again, the government must remain neutral between its citizens, lest it be considered illegitimate, because again, it's going past that obligation it's going past that moral obligation that I've already stated. My third point is that by having people pay for others, the humanity of the individuals themselves is disrespected. So I'm going to read a piece of evidence here. Gary Herbert discusses the importance of autonomy in his book, A Philosophical History of Rights. He explains, the precondition of coexisting freedom is that each be conceived as the author of his actions, responsible for what he does. Were one not recognized as responsible for what one does, one would be denied the dignity that belongs to a free and responsible being. Herbert continues, to treat another as an object could conceivably be to treat him as an object of our pity, our concern, and our good intentions, not simply as an object to be used and or abused for our own benefit. To summarize, autonomy is what gives a person dignity. Furthermore, disrespecting a person's autonomy makes them less than human. So if a government says, yes, it's okay, we're going to provide for these people, it's disrespecting their sole humanity. It's making them less than human, and it's treating them as animals, basically. So, my next point is, again, that single payer goes beyond compensating for the disadvantaged, because as my opponent states in his case, his idea of justice and fairness as a theory only provides for the disadvantaged, or the people who are born into the disadvantaged class. As Rawls states, it's considered the natural lottery. So again, if we implement a single payer healthcare policy, it would go beyond compensating for the natural lottery, and that would make it unjust, even by Rawls's theory. Okay. So now I'm going to move on to my voting issues. My first voting issue is the fact that, again, the sole moral obligation, as I've already proven, is that autonomy is the single most important thing to be protected by the government. That's the sole obligation of the state, is to protect the autonomy of its citizens in order for them to be able to exercise their political and economic freedoms. When a government decides it's okay to take away money from its citizens, that would be the economic freedom. It's basically the same thing as saying, no, you can't vote anymore because we need to preserve the general good. We need to sacrifice you because you're not important. We need to sacrifice you for the general good. And that's what makes redistribution so unjust.
My opponent has stated that the only moral obligation a government has is to autonomy, yet justice is a moral obligation the government has to its people, as I have stated, because under the veil of ignorance, nobody would want to live in an unjust government. And the obligations are not to the individual. The obligation of a government is to be equally fair to all because morally that's the only duty of the government is to allow its citizens fairness and equality, because while my opponent stated that fairness isn't a part of moral obligation, without fairness the government could simply unfairly take property from others or unfairly allow some people autonomy in specific instances and some in others not, because fairness is an equal duty to all citizens, and therefore it isn't a moral obligation that we equally apply all the laws of autonomy and all the rights to everyone. And now, my opponent stated that without autonomy, or with this single-payer system, we would be redistributing the money, and that would be simply violating autonomy. Yet, I have stated why we should redistribute the money, and it's because under the veil of ignorance, it establishes a system where those who were unlucky enough to be born into poverty would still have a system where they can be advantaged as those who were born into a high class. It's fixing the inherent social structures that in society, whereas my opponent is simply saying that the government only has a moral obligation to autonomy because the citizens consent to a government, which, as I have stated, the citizens, if they were to enter a society where they had no idea what their class or status in society would be, they would agree upon a system where if they were unlucky enough to be born into the lower classes, they would still have access to health care and a right to life. And if it's necessary to tax people, then we should still do it, because it would, the taxes of the money, who are those fortunate enough to have that money, would be going towards people so that they could have a fundamental right and would still be allowed to be advantaged in a way that those who are born into a higher class are advantaged in the current system of health care. And for these reasons, I can only see and affirm on today's resolution.